Do you know who I am? The words cut through the quiet like a blade. Standing only inches from the soldier's face, Melania Trump stared with the kind of authority that had made others step aside. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward. Even the tourists, who had been whispering moments ago, froze in stunned silence. Everyone thought the guard would blink. Everyone thought he would step aside. But he didn't move. The royal guard, stone-faced, stood rooted in place, boots planted, eyes locked forward, rifle steady against his shoulder. He had faced storms. He had faced war. He had faced grief so heavy that ordinary people would collapse under it. And now, in this moment, he faced her. The crowd's breath caught. Parents pulled children closer. Veterans, standing a little straighter, narrowed their eyes. The silence grew so sharp it almost rang in the air. Melania leaned in, her voice lower now, dripping with disdain. Do you understand what it means to stand in my way? The guard did not flinch, not a twitch, not a blink, not a sound. But stillness was louder than any shouted word. And in that stillness, the crowd felt something shift. Some whispered, some gasped, because they knew what this silence meant. Discipline, duty, and defiance without disrespect. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to break, waiting for him to bow, waiting for him to remember who she was. But the truth, he remembered something else, something no one in that crowd could see. Behind those sharp eyes, behind that unshaken jawline, was a memory carved deep into his soul. A memory of a friend who never made it home. A brother in arms who once told him, never let anyone walk over what you stand for, not even the powerful. The tension was unbearable now. Would he speak? Would he move? Would he crumble under the weight of her status? And then he turned his head just slightly, just enough. The crowd gasped. Reporters raised cameras higher. Even Melanian's lips parted, certain that the guard was about to apologize, about to recognize her, about to give her what she demanded. But when he finally spoke, his words were like thunder after a long storm. Ma'am, here. It is not about who you are. It is about what I stand for. Silence. Stunned, absolute silence. And in that moment, the world realized, this was not going to be an ordinary standoff. This was the beginning of a story no one would ever forget. Before that single, unforgettable moment, the guard's life had already been shaped by battles few could imagine. His name was Sergeant Daniel Carter, though the crowd would never hear it spoken that day. To them, he was simply the guard, tall, disciplined, silent, but behind the uniform was a man whose every breath carried the weight of sacrifice. Daniel had been deployed 3 times. On his second tour, in a desert far from home, he lost his closest friend, Corporal James Jimmy Rowe. They had trained together, laughed together, survived ambushes side by side. But one morning, under a sky thick with dust and fire, Jimmy didn't make it back. Daniel had carried his body to the medics himself. He still remembered the dog tag slipping from Jimmy's neck into his palm. And he remembered Jimmy's last words whispered through a bloodied smile. Don't let me be forgotten. Don't let this mean nothing. That promise haunted Daniel. It was why he returned home, not to escape the memory, but to protect the very symbols Jimmy had died for. Tradition, honor, duty. The guard was not a job. It was his oath, his redemption, his way of keeping Jimmy alive. Every day, in flawless silence, Daniel stood watch. Rain or heat, day or night. His rifle was not only a weapon, it was a vow. Every precise step, every rigid movement, every second of stillness was a way of saying, we remember, we guard, we never forget. That's why Arlington was not just stone and grass to him. That's why the palace grounds were not just brick and marble. To Daniel, these places were sacred. They were witnesses of sacrifice. And on that day, the sacredness of his post collided with the arrogance of power, because standing before him, dressed in perfection and armed with her presence, was Melania Trump. To the public, she was glamorous, untouchable, and known for commanding respect simply by entering a room. She was a figure whose life had always revolved around prestige, red carpets, political summits, world leaders, flashing cameras. Wherever she went, doors opened, rules bent, people shifted aside, and perhaps she expected nothing less on this day. Her entourage had parted the crowd with sharp whispers and purposeful steps. Security detail walked ahead, clearing space, though they hesitated when they reached the guard, because everyone knew one truth. The guard does not move. It didn't matter if you were a tourist with a camera, a senator with a title, or a celebrity with millions of followers. That line of stone, that line of honor, was not meant to be crossed. The guard's job was absolute. He stood not for himself, but for those who could no longer stand. But Melania wasn't used to know. To her, protocol was negotiable. Status was a weapon, and she believed that her identity alone was enough to make barriers disappear. "Do you know who I am?" she had demanded, with a voice that dripped with certainty. What she didn't realize, and what the crowd was about to witness, was that the guard's silence carried more weight than her question. Reporters sensed the tension immediately. Cameras rose higher. Microphones leaned closer. They smelled a story. Some of them whispered, not believing what they were seeing, a First Lady's confidence clashing with the immovable wall of military tradition. Children in the crowd clung to their parents, sensing the unease. Veterans muttered under their breath, recognizing the fire and the guard's stillness, and officials in suits shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene. The location itself seemed to hum with importance. The palace steps, ancient stone polished by centuries of honor, felt like a stage where discipline and arrogance were about to duel. For generations, those steps had carried soldiers' boots, carried coffins draped in flags, carried history itself. To disrupt it wasn't just disrespect, it was desecration. And Daniel knew it. Every second he stood there, the weight of Jimmy's memory pressed against him. Every second, the whispers of duty thundered in his chest. Do not move. Do not yield, not even to power. To the crowd, he looked like an unshaken statue. But inside, Daniel wasn't numb. He was alive with memory, with pain, with promise. Melania, however, saw none of that. She saw only a man blocking her way, a man who should have recognized her status, her influence, her name. She wasn't just frustrated, she was insulted. And that's when the seeds of confrontation began to grow, because for her, this was about identity. For him, it was about honor, and only one of them could stand unbroken. The clash hadn't exploded yet, but the storm clouds had gathered. The silence before the storm is often the loudest. And on those palace steps, under the watchful eyes of history, silence was about to break. The confrontation didn't end with her question. It was only the beginning. Melania Trump's eyes narrowed as she looked at the royal guard standing like a wall before her. She was a woman used to people moving, bending, adjusting the moment. Her presence demanded it, but this soldier didn't even blink. At first, she gave a sharp laugh, the kind meant to cover irritation with a veil of charm. "Really, you're just going to stand there?" she asked, her voice carrying across the stone courtyard. No reply, not a twitch. The crowd stirred. A tourist in the front whispered, "He can't answer her. It's against protocol." Another, shaking his head, muttered, "But that's the point. He's not supposed to move. Not for anyone." Reporters edged closer, microphones angled forward. The tension was like blood in the water, and they were sharks ready for the feeding frenzy. They knew this wasn't just a scene, it was history. In the making, Melania tried again, this time louder, sharper. "Do you not understand who I am? I am the former First Lady of the United States. Do you think you can ignore that?" The guard's jaw didn't even flex. His eyes were fixed on the invisible horizon only he could see. For him, this wasn't Melania Trump. It wasn't a celebrity. It wasn't even a politician. It was a test. And he had promised Jimmy and every fallen brother that he would never fail a test of honor. The silence stretched. It became heavy, almost unbearable. Children in the crowd pressed closer to their parents. A little girl whispered, "Why isn't he talking?" Her father answered softly, "Because his silence is his answer." But silence was not enough for her. She stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply against the stone. The sound echoed across the courtyard like gunfire. "I asked you a question," she said coldly, "and I expect an answer. Now." Still, he did not move. The veterans in the crowd exchanged looks. One, an older man with medals on his chest, folded his arms and muttered, "Stand tall, son. Stand tall." Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in. Every second was recorded. Every angle captured. Social media was already buzzing. Clips were being uploaded within moments, watched by thousands who couldn't believe what they were seeing. A battle of power and principle captured Liv. Her irritation sharpened into anger. Her face tightened. Her voice lost the polished edge. "Of diplomacy, you're embarrassing yourself," she snapped. "Do you think this silence makes you strong? It makes you pathetic. Move aside before I make a call you'll regret." The crowd gasped. That line, "before I make a call," landed heavy. Threat, power, influence. The air seemed to shiver with it, but the guard remained on. Inside, Daniel Carter remembered Jimmy's laugh, remembered the smell of sand and smoke, remembered the last promise whispered into his ear, "Don't let anyone walk over what you stand for." That promise burned brighter now than her words ever could. Seconds turned into an eternity. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was alive. It was a declaration without sound. The crowd, couldn't take their eyes off him. He wasn't just a guard anymore. It was something larger, a symbol, a mountain standing against the storm, and the storm pressed harder. Melania's entourage shifted uncomfortably. One of her aides whispered, "Ma'am, maybe we should," but she cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. Her pride was already on the line. Too many cameras, too many witnesses. Backing down now would mean weakness, and weakness was something she could not afford. She leaned even closer, her perfume mingling with the sharp scent of gunmetal. Her voice was almost a hiss. "You think this little act of silence makes you noble? Let me tell you something. Men like you're forgotten. Men like me, we are remembered." That word forgotten pierced deeper than she could have imagined. The crowd didn't know, but inside Daniel it hit a scar that would never heal. Forgotten, the very thing Jimmy had begged him never to allow. The very fear that kept him standing guard day after day, rain or shine. Forgotten. But instead of breaking him, it made him steel himself even more. A boy in the crowd whispered to his mother, "Why isn't he fighting back?" The mother answered, softly, "Because real strength doesn't need to shout." The silence grew unbearable again. You could hear the faint buzzing of camera equipment, the shuffle of restless feet, even the rustle of flags in the distance. But from the guard, there was nothing. Nothing but stillness. Melania's voice rose again, sharper, echoing across the courtyard. "You will regret this. Do you hear me? When people find out you disrespected me, you'll wish you'd stepped aside. You'll lose your post. You'll lose your honor. You'll lose everything." She paused, expecting fear, expecting movement. But still, the guard didn't shift. The veterans in the crowd stood straighter. One whispered, "That's what honor looks like. That's what they'll never understand." The escalation wasn't only in her voice now, it was in her body language. The subtle tilt of her chin, the tightening of her jaw, the way her hand curled into a fist at her side. She had moved from entitlement to anger, from anger to frustration, and now, she was teetering on the edge of losing control. The crowd could feel it, they could see it, and they braced for the inevitable moment, when words would no longer be enough for her, because this wasn't just a standoff anymore. It was a duel of wills. One side armed with pride, the other side armed with silence, and the silence was winning. Every camera was locked. Every witness held their breath. Children clung tighter. Reporters whispered about front-page headlines. Veterans whispered prayers of respect. And in the center of it all, a single guard stood, unbroken, unshaken, unbent. But storms don't fade quietly. They break, they strike, they test everything in their path. And as the crowd felt the air grow heavier, as the tension grew so tight it could snap, they knew the line between words and action was about to be crossed, because Melania Trump wasn't finished. She was only just beginning. Asterisk. The silence had stretched as far as it could go. Every whisper, every breath in the crowd hung like glass in the air, fragile and ready to shatter. And then Melania moved. Her heels clicked forward until she stood barely an arm's length from him. The guard remained frozen, eyes locked past her shoulder, fixed on the invisible horizon only he could see. He was trained for this. To resist distraction, to ignore provocation, to embody stillness. But she wasn't content with being ignored. Her pride demanded more. "Look at me," she snapped, her voice sharp as a whip. No movement. "Look at me," she demanded, raising her hand, and then in one swift motion that sent the entire courtyard into collective shock, she tapped the barrel of his rifle with the edge of her palm. Gasps tore through the crowd. Cameras clicked furiously. A child cried out in alarm. Every veteran in the square stiffened instantly, because they knew what had just happened. The line had been crossed. The guard's weapon was not a decoration, it was a symbol of fallen soldiers, of unbroken discipline, of sacred duty. To touch it, to strike it, even lightly, was to desecrate the vow it represented. The air seemed to freeze. For a heartbeat, no one knew what would happen next. Daniel Carter felt the impact of her hand like fire on steel. His mind flashed to Jimmy, to the battlefield, to the promise whispered on dying lips. Don't let them forget. Don't let it mean nothing. He didn't rage. He didn't break. He didn't even raise his voice. Instead, in one sharp, disciplined motion drilled into his bones by years of service, the guard shifted his rifle away from her hand, stepped half a pace forward, and brought his boot down on the stone with thunder. The sound cracked across the courtyard like a gunshot. The crowd leapt back, startled. Reporters gasped. The sharp stomp echoed against the palace walls, booming like the voice of history itself. And then silence, deafening, absolute silence. Daniel's eyes, still forward, burned with quiet fire. He had not broken protocol. He had not attacked. He had not spoken out of turn. He had simply reminded everyone that the guard was not a man to be touched. The crowd erupted into whispers. He moved. Did you see that? He warned her. The veterans nodded grimly. That's discipline. That's how it's done, one murmured. But Melania, stunned for a split second, recovered quickly, her face hardening. She wasn't about to be embarrassed in front of the world. Her voice rose, sharper, louder. You dare stomp at me? Do you know what that means? Do you know what happens to men who challenge people like me? She raised her hand again, this time not to tap but to shove his chest. Her palm pressed against the fabric of his pristine uniform, pushing as if to force him aside. The crowd gasped again, louder this time. A child cried. A veteran cursed under his breath. The security detail hesitated, frozen between protecting their charge and respecting sacred tradition. And then, the guard moved again. Not wildly, not angrily, but with precision that sent chills through the air. In a single, controlled motion, Daniel took one step forward, forcing her hand off his chest without ever touching her directly. His boot thundered again, harder, sharper, rattling the stone beneath them. The sound echoed like a cannon. His rifle shifted back into position, the gleaming steel catching the afternoon sun. And then, for the first time since she arrived, he turned his head. The motion was slight, deliberate, but the effect was explosive. The crowd roared with gasps. Reporters shoved forward. Children froze. Even Melania herself faltered. His voice followed, low, steady, carrying across the square with the weight of centuries. Ma'am, this post is not about you. It is about every soldier who gave their life, and you will not dishonor them. The words struck like a blade, calm, controlled, but unshakable. The courtyard fell utterly silent. No coughs, no shuffles. Not even the birds dared to sing. Melania's lips parted. For the first time, she had no words. She, who had commanded rooms of diplomats, who had faced cameras and critics alike, found herself speechless before a single, unyielding guard. The veterans began to clap softly. A single pair of hands at first, then another, and then another. The sound grew, spreading like fire, until the courtyard filled with a steady rhythm of respect. But Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't bask in it. His face was carved from stone. His eyes returned forward. His rifle remained steady. Because this wasn't about applause. This wasn't about winning. This was about honor. Melania's pride cracked in that silence. She looked around at the cameras, at the crowd, at the veterans standing taller than ever, and realized she had miscalculated. Her power here meant nothing. Her status meant nothing. Her name meant nothing. The guard had reminded her, and the world, of a truth older and stronger than influence. Tradition does not bow. Reporters whispered headlines. Parents told their children to remember this moment. Veterans saluted silently, and Daniel Carter, the man behind the uniform, felt Jimmy's voice echo through his chest like a heartbeat. You did it. The promise, the turning point had come. The storm had struck, and now everyone waited to see the cost. Asterisk for a heartbeat. Time itself seemed frozen. The guard's words still echoed in the air. This post is not about you. It is about every soldier who gave their life, and you will not dishonor them. No one dared move. Reporters held their microphones steady. Cameras zoomed so close you could see the tension in every line of his jaw. Children clutched their parents. Veterans, their eyes glistening, stood straighter than they had in years. And Melania Trump, the woman who had never been told no in public, stood paralyzed. Her face flushed red, not just with anger, but with the creeping realization that the tide of the crowd had turned against her, because in that moment, she was no longer the most powerful person in the square. The guard was. Her voice cracked as she tried to recover. You can't speak to me like that. Do you know the consequences? But the threat rang hollow. No one believed it anymore. Not when veterans began clapping louder. Not when tourists raised their phones high to capture every second. Not when the silence of the guard spoke louder than her words ever could. The applause spread, echoing through the courtyard until it was impossible to ignore. And with it came murmurs. He stood his ground. He's protecting all of them. That's real courage. For the first time, Melania looked shaken. Her eyes darted to the cameras, to her entourage, to the crowd who was no longer with her but against her. Every second she stayed, every glare she gave, only deepened her humiliation. And then security moved. Not the guard's security, not the veterans, but her own. 2 agents stepped forward, their faces taut with professionalism, but their eyes filled with unease. One leaned close and whispered, "Ma'am, this is over. We need to leave." She shook her head violently. "No, do you see what he did? He humiliated me. He should be punished." But the agent cut her off, a rare breach of formality. With all due respect, ma'am, you were the one being filmed. Her breath caught. She glanced around again, and it finally sank in. Every lens, every phone, every set of eyes was against her, and the guard. He had already turned his head back forward. He had already locked his eyes on the horizon again, boots planted, rifle steady, silent as stone. He hadn't moved to celebrate. He hadn't smirked. He hadn't acknowledged his victory, because to him there was no victory, only duty, and that was the greatest humiliation of all. Melania had thrown everything at him, words, status, threats, even her hands, and he had met it with silence, stillness, and a single disciplined reminder of honor. She had fought for dominance, he had stood for memory. She had sought to be seen. He had reminded the world of those unseen, and the world knew instantly who had won. A reporter's voice cut through the noise. This will be the headline everywhere by tonight. Another whispered, it already is. Indeed, around the world, phones buzzed as live streams exploded, clips spread like wildfire, captions blazing across social media. Do you know who I am? Versus, it's not about you. But in the courtyard, the guard didn't see any of it, didn't care. His oath was not to fame. His oath was not to the crowd. His oath was not to humiliation or triumph. His oath was to the fallen, and to them alone. As Melanian's agents finally ushered her back, her protests growing weaker, the applause rose louder. Veterans saluted, children waved tiny flags. Parents whispered to their sons and daughters, remember this moment, remember what you just saw. And still, Daniel Carter, the guard whose name the crowd didn't even know, stood like a monument carved from stone. No reaction, no movement, no pride, only silence. That silence was the final word, because humiliation fades, news cycles turn. But the image of one guard standing unbroken, unbent, and unbowed, that lasts forever. When the storm had passed, silence settled over the courtyard again, but it wasn't the same silence that had hung there before. This silence was reverent, heavy, sacred. Melania Trump had been escorted away, her voice fading into the background, like a storm retreating beyond the horizon. The crowd, still buzzing with adrenaline, slowly shifted their focus back to the one man who had not wavered. The royal guard, Daniel Carter, stood with rifle steady, eyes forward, as though nothing had happened. His face betrayed no pride, no anger, no satisfaction, only the steady, immovable calm of duty. To him, this was not a victory. It was simply a promise kept. And yet, around him, the atmosphere transformed. A colonel in dress uniform, silver hair, gleaming in the light, stepped forward from the crowd. For a moment, he simply stood in silence, staring at the young guard as though seeing not just a soldier, but a reflection of every man and woman who had ever stood watch before him. Then, slowly, deliberately, the colonel raised his hand in a crisp salute. The gesture cut through the air like a blade. It was not casual, it was not polite. It was respect. One soldier to another, the crowd followed, in their own ways. Some clapped softly, some pressed hands over hearts. Veterans bowed their heads, and somewhere near the front, a little boy tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered, almost in awe, "Mom, is he a hero?" The mother smiled, her eyes shining. "Yes, sweetheart, he is." The boy whispered the word again to himself, hero, as though it were the most important word he had ever learned. But Daniel didn't hear any of it. His ears were filled with something else. A voice, faint but eternal, echoing in the chambers of his memory, Jimmy's voice, "Don't let me be forgotten, don't let this mean nothing." And Daniel knew today, that promise had been honored, not through anger, not through violence, but through stillness, through silence, through the strength of refusing to bend. As the crowd slowly dispersed, as reporters hurried away to file their stories, as families carried children who would never forget what they saw, Daniel remained where he had always been, at his post. Hours later, when the sun dipped low and the sky bled into gold, his shift finally ended. Quietly, without fanfare, he stepped away from his post and into the shadow of the barracks. There, away from the eyes of the crowd, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, battered dog tag. The name etched into the metal was worn, but clear. James Rowe. Daniel closed his fist around it and whispered softly, "They'll never forget, Jimmy, not while I stand." The weight of the day pressed down on him, but it didn't break him. Instead, it reminded him why he was there, why he would always be there, because some men serve for recognition, some serve for pride, but men like Daniel Carter serve for memory, and memory never dies. The courtyard would return to normal. Tourists would walk its stones again, cameras flashing, voices rising in wonder, but somewhere deep within those walls, the echo of a stomp, the echo of a soldier's words, would live forever. This post is not about you. It is about every soldier who gave their life. And you will not dishonor them. Words carved into history, words whispered to the fallen, words that turned one silent guard into a symbol. And as the evening shadows stretched long, Daniel Carter knew the truth. He wasn't standing alone, he never had been. Behind him stood generations. Beside him, unseen, stood Jimmy. And before him stood the weight of tradition, unbroken, eternal, sacred. What happened that day on the palace steps wasn't just a clash between a powerful woman and a silent soldier. It was something bigger, that it was a reminder that in a world obsessed with status, titles, and recognition, there are still places where none of that matters. There are still men and women who stand for something greater than themselves, something that cannot be bought, threatened, or broken. The Royal Guard didn't need to shout. He didn't need to fight. He didn't even need to move more than a step. His silence spoke louder than any speech. His stillness was stronger than any threat. And that's why people remember him. Because discipline is louder than arrogance. Because tradition is stronger than pride. Because silence, when held with honor, can shake the world. Watched him return to his post. They understood something they would never forget. Tradition is not weakness. Stillness is strength. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us in our own lives. When chaos presses, when arrogance shouts, when the world tells us to bend, sometimes the strongest answer is not to fight, but to stand. So remember the guard, remember his silence, remember what it stood for. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of the strength that comes from honor and duty, then share it, tell it, keep it alive, because stories like this are not just entertainment, they are legacy. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and never forget, silence, when grounded in honor, is the loudest voice of all.